here. So on the first question, how do we think about our outreach plans for different stakeholders? And again, I want to acknowledge that we are a month or even 5 weeks into this pandemic and crisis. And so I know so many of you have already been implementing outreach plans. As we continue to refine those plans, or if you haven't quite laid out a more comprehensive plan, we'd really encourage you to think about the segmentation, of your audience. So obviously, your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders. You could argue if your board is internal or external, they probably straddle the line, but obviously they're the group that are closest to you, are helping your head and staff navigate some of the tough decisions that have been made and will continue to be made. And naturally, and we'll talk about this, every constituency, every one of these segments, right, has different concerns, are impacted in different ways by the remote learning, for example. And then I think you could take it a step further, that when you think about your external stakeholders, you could do even deeper segmentation of your external donors. So thinking about your top 100 or your top 200 or even your top 25 donors, what is the conversation with each of those segments need to look like? We're well into the fiscal year. So when you think about your annual fund, you have a good number of families who have already made gifts. And within those group of families, who has the ability to do something more because you are seeking some extra funding because of the response to the crisis. And then, of course, who are the people who have not yet made an annual fund commitment? And for that group, how do we massage or change the messaging and appeal? Because what we're grappling with since the last 5 or 6 weeks is very different than the appeal they received maybe at year end or the beginning of the year, right? And then, of course, there's the broader community. Again, there's many ways to segment it, but I remember meeting with an insurance executive who was a parent at a New York City school many, many years ago, and he said that most business challenges can be solved with good segmentation. And I had to think a lot about what he meant by that, and it has become very clear to me over the years, and it's become extra clear to me in this moment, because I think good segmentation, the smart segmentation, you don't need to overdo it, helps you move forward because you can, again, tailor messaging and really be appropriate given the sensitivity of what's happening. Moving to the next slide, I think one thing that we've learned, certainly through this crisis, but even through the Great Recession and other crises, there needs to be a appropriate rollout of your outreach and the messaging of that outreach, right? The first call or the first email that we send to our donor community should not be and cannot be a solicitation, right? And so we've been using this framework for many of our clients, and we've, again, learned from many of you and other organizations how this has played out. So, in terms of the first outreach, certainly making sure we're beginning with empathy, that we're asking our donors how they and their families and their circle are doing. If there are things that the school can do to be helpful. I know many schools have reached out in a special way to staff. There are many schools that, have, hourly workers, right, who, because the school is closed, have been affected, right, in ways that it might be a little different than the faculty. But again, I think first outreach, this notion of empathy and really checking on how people are doing. I think a second outreach, and again, in some cases, maybe the first and second can be combined, But I think a second step is to really begin to educate and inform. People are hungry for information during periods of uncertainty. And even though we don't know all the answers, I think it's important to be transparent about that and to share what we do know. And I think people want to know how has the school responded? Many of you are now many weeks into virtual learning. How is that going? What have we learned? What are some of the adjustments that we plan on making, in the coming weeks and months? What are some stories of resolve and how the community has come together? But the flip side to this is also, what are the challenges that we're facing, right? What are the financial, perhaps shortfalls, the increases in requests for financial aid that we're beginning to see? Have there been furloughs that have to be made because of the budgetary constraints and pressures that we're facing? I think, talking about both the good and the bad certainly is it's what people deserve, I think, and want. But I think importantly, especially for your donor community, allows you to move to that third outreach, which is to really talk more specifically about what the institution needs right at this time. And again, I know a number of schools have incorporated some of these challenges in your annual appeals. There are a few schools and certainly other nonprofits that have created special emergency funds because of COVID-19. And that messaging, again, is important to encourage and rationalize why we need funds at this time, right? So again, I think with some adjustments and refinement, I think this sort of three-step framework has been really effective for many of our organizations. Moving to slide 9, I think just to think about the how the messaging and the solicitation can be tailored based on some of that segmentation, right, I mentioned earlier. And again, we've laid out just some sample language. So many of you on the call are just, brilliant marketers and writers and are so good at this. But again, just as a framework to hopefully be constructive and helpful for you and your staff, thinking about your board and your top prospects, right? These are the people who have been with you for years, in some cases decades, right? And this notion of leadership, this notion that the need for leaders to step in and step up more than ever, because there are many in the community who are just uncertain, who don't have the visibility that they need, who may not have the wherewithal, who might be more affected economically, right? But this sort of notion of leadership messaging to the board. Again, I won't read all of these, but for current parents, for alumni outreach, I'm a proud graduate of Regis High School, and everyone is learning about Regis if they haven't, because of Dr. Anthony Fauci. And as you can imagine, Dr. Anthony Fauci has been incorporated in so much of the outreach and communication as someone to be proud of, and to just demonstrate that, in this case, Regis High School, but each one of you on this call can make the same, that you have alumni who are out in the community doing good and important work, and we have to remember that, and that doesn't change, right, given the crisis. Right. So again, there's a nuance there to the alumni versus your current parents. And then, of course, friends, grandparents would have their own messaging. So we wanted to give you, again, just some tips and a bit of a framework to think about constituent-specific messaging. And then moving on to slide 10, and then I'm happy to turn it over to Charlie to take us to the end before we get to questions. What are some of the immediate and even longer term effects on COVID-19, on your institutions? And And again, I'm sure all of you could add to this list, but certainly meeting your annual fund goals, increased pressure on the operating budget. We were talking to Barbara as we were getting ready to start the call. I know that NYSAIS has been convening some conversations around enrollment and what the future might look like, what next year might look like given the pandemic and certainly the economic fallout. I know many schools we're working with are already beginning to see increases in tuition assistance, et cetera. I would add to this list, I've have been privy to many investment committee calls and conversations on some school boards where they are considering increasing the endowment spend rate in the near term from maybe what might be 4% to 5 or 6% on a short-term basis as a way to help ease some of this pressure. I'm sure all of you have spend policies that are based on a 3-year rolling average, right? And so certainly that's what the foundation world does. So again, I think thinking about the mid and longer term effect, I think is going to be very real. But as it relates to all of us, the development and advancement professionals, these issues will become very important for the conversations that you will be having with donors and their communications, certainly as the end of the year approaches, and certainly through the summer, as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Charlie, who will take us through the next set of slides. And again, we want to make sure we leave time for questions.
Eric, thanks very much. And good morning to everybody. It's nice to be with you. So yeah, it's clearly a challenging time. I have to say, I'm also finding it to be very rewarding. Like, it's incredible to see the resiliency of charitable organizations out there, the staff and the way they're working and working differently, but also the donors. We talk a lot about empathy, showing empathy towards the donor community. We're also seeing that the donor community is providing a lot of empathy towards organizations and the challenges that each of you face. So clearly, the focus right now is to get the schools, get the symphonies, get the hospitals from today to the end of their fiscal year, through June. Because realistically, most people can't think and plan beyond that right now. But they're a captive audience, like alumni, parents, grateful patients, parishioners, like they can be engaged. And we're certainly seeing that across our client base. Before this call, I was on a video conference and there were 20 members of staff from this organization who were on the video conference. 16 of them had nothing to do with fundraising. Like they had no involvement in fundraising, but they were prepared to help. And it was all about assigning them outreach, 20, 25 names each, giving them a script, giving them coaching, and activating them. So these 20 members of staff, between them over the next 2 weeks, are going to phone 1,000 people. And they're starting with those who've been most supportive, those who have pledge payments that are due, lapsed donors, and then also people who have no giving history with the organization. And what their aim is to raise awareness, connect with people, and demonstrate the need that the organization has between now and the 30th of June. And what we're seeing across all of our clients, or many of them, is that people want to hear that. They want to have that conversation, and they're prepared to respond. So in terms of recommendations and strategies to get you to your year end, one is be very adaptable. Obviously pivot to virtual meetings. There are thousands of people who for the first time ever are using Zoom, teleconferences even. And what we're hearing is that they're enjoying it. I think longer term, this is going to be a new aspect of your philanthropy program. We have conversations in the morning with a philanthropist, and then there's follow-up conversations with them in the evening. Like that would be unheard of sort of pre-COVID-19. So things can happen a lot faster. We're also seeing our clients really turn to those in their community, alumni, parents, even students who are really savvy social media users. And they're fueling those heavy users and using their skill, using their networks to get information out, to raise awareness of the school, of the symphony, of the hospital. Well, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. We are telling all of our clients like to plan for a big, massive fundraising push in June. In New York, we're 5 weeks into the stay-at-home orders. How long that'll last, no one knows. But we're already starting to hear and see people wanting and needing to do something philanthropic. How can I help? Where is my money needed? What do you need? So if you're able to, if you're planning on a June push, you really have to start now to sort of line up the volunteers, train them, give them assignments, realign your direct mail program, your email communications, so that it all kind of lands in June in an appropriate way. And then I would say, push for June 30th and then plan on staying the course through July. If you can get the volunteer effort up and running, if you can get the outreach going, there's every reason that you'll be able to sustain that activity through July, and that'll help you towards next year's planning. Clearly, there's a lot of galas and events and golf outings and other activities that are not going to happen. What we've been recommending to donors is that you contact many of those people, as many as you can, and do it with a major gift mindset. Not so much about sort of business as usual, but getting them to think longer term. Maybe they took a $10,000 table or a $5,000 golf package. Give them options. Would you make that $5,000 gift? Would you gift $3,500, which would have been the charitable deduction? Would you spread the $5,000 or $3,500 over course of time? $2,500 this year, $2,500 next year. Getting people thinking bigger and even longer term, with longer term being, maybe 12, 18 months, 18, 24 months, will give you a chance to have an appropriate conversation about what's needed right now, but also where you're heading next year. So if you can advance to the next slide. For those of you who are in campaigns or in special initiatives, it's a particularly important time for you. We did a video conference yesterday for a group of not-for-profits in Houston, and one of the senior people from a major foundation there that's clearly being inundated with proposals now, he said, any proposal that we get that speaks of business as usual, that isn't kind of the moment, that hasn't been adapted, adjusted, we just put off to the side. So it doesn't mean that campaigns can't move ahead, but it's really essential that you update the language, you update the focus, you update the timelines, or at least be seen to be doing that. Because what it creates is an opportunity for philanthropists, for parents, alumni, for others, to come in and be the hero for you. And we're starting to see this. Maybe the school is building a new learning commons, and the current environment might push off construction for 6 months, a year. Maybe it's slowing down the achievement of that financial target. So they're developing scenarios. Here's scenario A, scenario B. This puts us back maybe 6 months. That one puts us back 18 months. And sharing this with people who have the philanthropic wherewithal to make a real difference and to keep you on your original track, we think has a lot of merit. And we're already seeing this. People don't want things that they care about deeply to suffer through this crisis. They just want, and in many cases sort of need to know that the school, the hospital is thinking and adapting their narrative, adapting their financial expectations, maybe anticipating a fewer number of lead gifts or more number of major gifts than would have been the case pre-COVID-19. So following this sort of roadmap, adjusting plans, putting more emphasis on briefing and stewardship, giving people a chance to step up if they're able to be a hero, review the pipeline, probably be a lot more conservative about people's readiness, but don't make the decisions for them necessarily. Spend a lot of time on communications and probably engaging people more often than you think would be appropriate normally, because there is that opportunity. And then clearly updating scripts and materials to kind of reflect the moment that we're in now. Sarah, if you advance to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about getting to your year end. We talked a little bit about how to deal with campaigns and special initiatives. There is going to come a time pretty soon when people say, let's at least start thinking and planning for the future. We're right in the middle of a major capital campaign feasibility study for a university in New Jersey. And we're doing lots of interviews with their largest stakeholders. And, we're saying to them, obviously now is not the right time, or is it? And a lot of their alumni are saying, well, right now is not the right time, but boy, we should be planning for it. And we should seize this opportunity to get ourselves ahead, to articulate a big dream, a bold vision. It may take us 7 years rather than 5, but we shouldn't be bashful about our future. So in terms of planning your own schedules, our recommendations are to sort of look at the next 90 days, post June 30th, as you would in many cases normally, and take stock of the financial situation. What's the impact on enrollment? What would fundraising need to raise in order to make a meaningful impact on any enrollment challenges you have? How could the endowment be used? We are seeing some clients where not only are they adapting their spending rate, they're taking wholesale investments out. We're going to take 10 million out and use it, and we have a plan for putting it back in. So I think there's going to be a lot of creative strategies that align clearly with fundraising with the development team. Look at performance, LIBUNs, SIBUNs, outstanding leadership gifts. It's probably going to take more scenarios that are going to have to be reviewed on a more regular basis to help you make the start next year that you want to make. If you go to the next slide, what we wanted to do is give you a framework of how some of these 30, 60, 90-day plans might look for your school, for your institution. And then mainly to encourage you to look at it and view it as a living document. I find this very compelling. This is something that can be shared with senior management, with a group of volunteers, with the board. There's a role for everybody in here. If anything, you might add more video calls with the board members. There's opportunities to use this framework to really have a serious, practical, immediate conversation with people about what's needed. And if you go to the next slide, Sarah, for us, these are really the hallmarks of a successful fundraising program. You have a core, compelling case to make. You have leadership, you have access to prospects, you have a plan. we would strongly encourage you to use the summer months, especially in consultation with, your board, parents, maybe even a few task forces to refresh and renew your strategies in each of these areas. Simplify the case, make it purposeful, avoid making it sort of needy or desperate or emergency. People don't give to that. Like we're hearing that time and time again. They give to organizations who they know and they like and they trust, and to leaders who have a purpose and a plan. Renew leadership. In good times and in bad, we hear from our clients, we've got to get our leadership more engaged, more involved. I would say the next several weeks and months are going to be an opportunity to do just that. I might not be prepared to join the board. I might not be prepared to join the development committee, but I would consider joining a task force, something more near term, something strategic, something that's going to help us do something special. The summer months are going to be a great opportunity and time for doing data analytics and looking at your constituencies in different ways in light of all that's happening. And then lastly, it's keep a focus on the long term, but realize as Eric and sort of, I think all of you are hearing just generally, that people don't know what the future is going to hold. So if you had a plan to ask them for $1 million over a 5-year period, now might not be the time to do it, but it possibly could be the time to talk with them about an initial $200,000 commitment that might be spread over a couple of years, that they might revisit in 6 months, 10 months with a view towards increasing it. So it's being very adaptable, but not apologetic in any way, and very purposeful in each of these areas.
So yes, there are a couple of interesting questions. One is, how do you frame messages to donors without worrying them that there's somehow the school is in jeopardy? And I think, Charlie, you may have mentioned that you don't want to appear desperate.
No, I mean, I would say we have important decisions to make. COVID-19 is impacting us in profound ways, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And if you use that to start a dialogue with them or advance a dialogue with them, it doesn't have to be fear-inducing, but it should be like really candid and of the moment.
Right, and to that point, another question was about how to frame your messages to compare the need of the school, which is definitely real, with the other needs that are related to COVID-19, such as food insecurity and healthcare. Donors might feel more, compelled.
Yeah, I'm happy to offer a few thoughts, and then Eric, this is a tough one, and yet people really care about education. It's very important to them. It's often the sort of the last philanthropic dollar that they'll cut. I think you have to represent your case to the best of your ability and put people in contact with leaders of the school who they know and like and trust, or will get to know and like and trust, and then leave it up to them as to how and where they allocate their philanthropy. It's not always the best and most worthy and most timely causes that receive philanthropic support. It's the ones where the leader is in front of them talking about how philanthropy can make a difference.
Great, thank you. Eric, did you add anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add very briefly. I go back to my, Dr. Anthony Fauci example. The school, your institutions are doing work that is actually quite relevant and directly tied to those issues that people care about. Now, it might be you're providing better Wi-Fi connections and technology to families who just don't have the wherewithal in your school to do that. You're supporting your hourly workers by continuing to pay them a wage, or we're really minimizing or mitigating furloughs or layoffs. because you care about these people who are so important to your school. So those are sort of internal ways that you are doing those things that, again, for some people may seem more urgent and more important. But again, the Dr. Fauci example is, think about your alumni, the parents in your school who are in this world, who are physicians, who are, again, in positions of leadership, et cetera, that by supporting this institution, you are furthering that, you are empowering that, et cetera. So again, I think there are ways to really message this that tap into some of those things that people view as very important and urgent. I go back to one of the slides that I walked through had kind of these, kind of the 3 steps of messaging. Or, Sarah, we worked with you, on campaigns, and many are in campaigns. And in some ways, we might need to separate what we're trying to close out this year and a bigger conversation that we may want to have, certainly with major donors, about the needs for the next year or 2 as they become more visible, as the enrollment sort of process plays out, right? So I have one school that I know is just doing just a series of briefings, not the asks quite yet, but kind of laying out some scenarios that they're beginning to build for, if we were to, see a spike of 15% increase, right, in financial aid requests, and a 3% decline in enrollment of full pay, right? They're just beginning to paint 2 or 3 possibilities, right? Like, here is our kind of base case, here is, worst case, and here is like an optimistic view, right? And again, this is not for the masses, Sarah, of course, and everyone, right? But this is for, your top 25, your board members, et cetera. And it will prepare them, I think, for some very thoughtful and strategic asks that they can make maybe in the early summer.
And I would imagine the 08-09 financial crisis and the impact it had on schools will be some guide. What's happening now is different, but I think most of your top donors, trustees would see that as a credible marker to base some of these scenarios on.
So I think Charlie and our team will look back, and we commit to circling some information that we can dig up for you. Barbara, I'm curious if NYSAIS might also have some of these statistics or anything around, again, Jocelyn, I'm not sure if you're asking around giving specifically or what happened to enrollment or financial aid. I can tell you, here's one stat that I know we've dug up and have been sharing. And it's campaign related, so I know this is not exactly what you're asking, but we, between 2007 and 2009, we as a firm, CCS, were working with 115 nonprofits that either were doing feasibility studies or were in campaign mode between 07 and 09. These organizations decided to keep plowing ahead, obviously with adjustments. 86% of those campaigns ended up achieving their goal. 90% of those campaigns ended up achieving at least 90% of their goal. So I think what we saw, at least from a campaign standpoint, was that these places ended up raising a lot of money. And again, there are many organizations who unfortunately didn't stick with it. And I think anecdotally, they found it quite difficult to reemerge. But only because, Jocelyn, it was top of mind, I wanted to share that statistic. There is an argument for sticking with your long-term plans. And I know from CCS, like, we have hard data that now backs that up. So
when we talk about like a school-based COVID-19 response and recovery fund, the vast majority of that fund really is focused on sort of your day-to-day bread and butter, sort of business as usual. It's a different way of packaging your annual fund. because you need to secure these resources so you can retain your best staff, so that you can, continue to invest in technology. You can, continue to help keep the
Financial aid.
environment, financial aid as sort of robust as possible, so you don't lose ground.
Yeah. I wanted to share. I know, Barbara, we're about to run up on time. I just, this is just such an upbeat and I think cool idea. I'm working with a school that is in a campaign, and again, this is shifting from kind of urgent, how do we hit our year-end goals, to how do we continue to cultivate major donors for more of our long-term, initiatives and priorities. And I'm sure many of you are doing virtual, like, to a donor, like, meet me for a coffee at 10 a.m. Let's have a cup of coffee together. Let's have a glass of wine at 5:30. I'm sure, more and more of that is happening. And I think, listen, I'm not sure how, as we've said at the top of the call, how long we're going to be in this period. So I have a school that is being really intentional about how to have that virtual engagement experience. I've only done it once personally in my family. I don't know if anyone's ever ordered, those really lovely meal kits where you can get a meal delivered to your home. I have a school that has put in we're working on an order with a company to do branded meal kits of the school, and they're going to send it to 4 or 5 families, and they're going to have a lunch together, right? And it's provided by the school. It's going to have the school mug, in the kit, and some kind of goodies in it. And again, I don't know how this is going to work. I don't know if the food is going to be bad, right? But my point is, I think there is room for us to be really creative and intentional about engagement in this virtual world, even if it's just for the next few months. But I suspect we're going to have to be thinking about this for longer. And so I thought I'd just share that kind of neat idea and, encourage you and your teams to, this is kind of an opportunity to think a little bit out of the box and creatively when it comes to cultivation.